I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film-loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to a film critic to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Adam Manery, to the Real Mental podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Me too. I'm really excited. I really love this movie, and I think we're going to have lots of fun talking about it. But before we start, why don't you tell the listeners who you are, what you do, where you work, so on and so forth?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm based out of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So also in Canada, but a little far away from you. I used to actually be a high school teacher. I taught social studies and English and would teach film in my classes, but eventually I reached a point where I kind of knew that I needed to leave that profession, and I branched out on my own. Right now in the film world, I run my own independent outlet called Points of Review. So I talk to directors, mostly independent directors, cover various film festivals, and offer kind of my insight into the latest projects.
That's fantastic. Well, let's just jump right into Wicked Little Letters, which is an English film that came out this year, and it's a very interesting movie. So, what was your take on it, Adam?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in that I got to watch this film for the first time at an early showing in Calgary with a packed audience. So that is definitely the way to see this film because it subverts your expectations pretty much from the first scene, and it will have you laughing from A to Z. And that was kind of the my main takeaway from this film, is that it doesn't kind of hold itself to the traditional boundaries of comedy, particularly with two strong female leads, which I'm sure we'll get into. And it is one that definitely you should try to watch with others.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you thought about the two female leads and who played them and, what was your
Mhm.
take on them?
Yeah, so basically, I'll give a little bit of a background about the film itself. So, Wicked Little Letters is based on a true story, which, when you get to the end of the film, is pretty wild. It's one of those that is a bit stranger than fiction. So, it's set in the 1920s in this little seaside town in England, and it stars Olivia Colman as a woman named Edith Swan, who's kind of a spinster, still living at home into her middle age. And she's starring alongside Jessie Buckley, who plays a character named Rose Gooding. They start off as friends until these wicked little letters start arriving in this small seaside town. And at first, they are directed just towards Edith with some of the most vulgar language that you will ever hear on screen, which was amazing. It was so perfect. So these letters start arriving, and everyone pins it on Jessie Buckley's character, Rose Gooding, because she has a bit of a foul mouth, which is a little bit different than some of the more traditional women in the town. But as the story unravels, we come to learn that maybe it isn't Rose, after all, who is sending these very vulgar letters to members of the town.
For sure. And their interaction is so interesting, isn't it? Because it's kind of a love-hate relationship, especially on Edith's part.
hmm Yeah, and I think that really is the core of the film, is the relationship between these two. Like, yes, it is obviously hilarious, it is vulgar, but more important than those aspects is this relationship we see, particularly when Edith is delivering her first statement to the police and they're asking her about her relationship with Rose, and she is having to paint her as this awful person, but we can see through the brilliant Olivia Colman's facial expressions, how much joy she has looking back on these moments that she shared with her, because they are, at least on the surface, almost antithetical to one another in the way that they've kind of gone through the world, the way that they view things, the way that they act outwardly, at least. And so it is quite fascinating because Coleman's character has to essentially lie to herself and to others about how she feels about this other woman.
For sure. And what I find especially interesting is how Rose has a partner who I think they really are a very happy couple. And, they fight whatever, but they are basically a solid couple. And she also has a child who she adores. And even though she lives an untraditional kind of a life, she has a lot of things that Edith doesn't have. Edith lives with a very emotionally abusive father and very controlling and very physically threatening, and a mother who has been reduced to this just sort of dithering little meek mouse. And, you can see that maybe this was not the life she chose, but this was a life that was thrust upon her. And although she resents Rose so much for being wild and free, she's also tremendously envious of her for being so wild and free.
Yeah, no, 100% right. And obviously, as we get into some spoiler territory, that becomes even more evident. But what is perhaps just as interesting to me, I would say, is Jessie Buckley's character, Rose, at moments wanting to be more like Edith, right? We see her cleaning the floors in a way that she hasn't before, but that kind of represents what she has been told a woman, a mother, should be. And Edith appears to have some of these values that Rose is lacking. So they're both kind of looking at each other and wanting, at least at times, a piece of the other, in a sense.
Yes, and I wanted to mention to you that we don't worry about spoilers here because if we don't use the spoilers, we can't really talk about the film.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to say is that both characters have trauma, like when poor Rose is dragged through court and accused of all, these awful crimes of obscenity. We discover that she was married to an abusive man and she escaped him. So she has her domestic violence, and Edith is living with this abusive man as well, who's her father. And so she has her version of domestic abuse, and they've dealt with it very differently. Rose has rebelled and gone wild, whereas Edith has become more repressed and more of a good Christian and more quiet and is seething like a volcano under the surface. So it's a very interesting portrayal of two different ways that people deal with their trauma. And I think it was very accurate.
Yeah, I was gonna ask your thought on that for sure. It just becomes so clear that we can only see so much from these outward actions, right? There is so much beneath the surface within both of these characters, really. More overtly, perhaps, in the actual plot of the film, we see Jessie Buckley's character, Rose, really going through this response to this traumatic upbringing and kind of the repression, both from a patriarchal sense, but also from a religious sense. She's kind of battling these two forces at once, both being represented, of course, by the amazing Timothy Spall, not in his character in this particular project, not so amazing, but how did you see, I guess I'm curious, those two forces kind of acting on Edith at one time?
So I think those two forces acted on, like you said, both Rose and Edith. I think that on Rose, it made her bristle and rebel. And the more she was pressured to conform, the less she could, and the more just wild she got. With Edith, because it's her father, I think, especially, she was desperate for his approval. And so she was willing to subsume all the life in her personality and just bury all the beautiful juiciness of herself, which there was plenty of, and just become this kind of shell and this persona. And, so again, like she just imploded, whereas Rose's character kind of exploded. And it's so sad because, Rose got all the disapproval of society at least initially. And Edith got all this tremendous approval and articles written in the paper. And,
Mm.
she was sort of had her, 10 minutes, 15 minutes of fame, briefly. And then, so she was getting all this, social status by being the good girl, but she was obviously so deeply alienated from herself and miserable. So obviously not a good solution. And of course, with Rose, she was kind of self-destructive. She would
Mhm.
do things that would sabotage her relationships with her friends, with her partner, with her kid. She was too angry. So she was leaking too much rage. Edith was leaking rage in a more indirect way, but Rose was leaking the rage very out there and yelling. So I just thought it was a very interesting representation of how they were very similar, kind of two
Mhm.
sides of the same coin.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that perfectly upon rewatch of the film, it opens with the conversation with Edith and her parents, and her mother, aghast, says, "What sort of person does this?" Writes these letters, and then her father immediately responds, "I think we know." And then to that, Edith, Olivia Colman, replies, "Well, we don't know for sure, father," right? It's this idea that we have these preconceived notions of a woman, of anyone who might use this sort of language, who might push these societal norms, and we don't stop to think that there might be another side to that. So upon rewatch, that initial conversation took on so much more meaning for me.
For sure. And, before we started, we were talking about the movie Poor Things and how we both loved it
Hmm.
and how it was, in part, a portrayal of a woman, embracing her sexuality. I think this movie is a real interesting movie in the sense of it's about women and their rage and different ways for women to express
Mm.
rage. And I think that Rose's character was kind of blowing up all over the place. She was having these explosions, whereas Edith, her rage got kind of twisted inside and came out in these very dark, sort of sideways ways, right? And so, two very dysfunctional ways of managing their anger, their rage, right? The explosion, not a good choice. And then this kind of insidious, sneaky, kind of venom leaking out is also
Hmm.
not a good way. So, both of them were expressing their rage because of their trauma in these very dysfunctional ways. And it got them both into trouble. Rose got into trouble because the way she was expressing her rage was not socially acceptable, but ultimately Edith got into trouble because hers was even less socially acceptable than
Hmm.
Rose's. So it's, for women to have an outlet to express their rage has been a conundrum since, civilization began. And, we still have such difficulty, having our own permission, having society's permission, and just having kind of appropriate models for expressing our rage as women.
Mhm. Yeah, and the response to this rage is shown so clearly through almost all of the men in this film. Really, I think you could say that Rose's partner is kind of the one who is responding to her as another human, right? But we have all of these supporting male characters that are quite funny in their own right, but look at these actions as almost foreign, like they don't even understand what is happening as Rose expresses herself in the same way that these men do.
Exactly. And now let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast is at 145 episodes and counting. Why not have a listen to it today? And that leads us to the character of the police officer, who I just loved her character because she was also really mad. She was mad at the patriarchy because
Mhm.
she was an excellent cop, and because she was a woman, she was thwarted in every way, and of course, she's the one who solved the crime.
Yeah, and this is rooted in the true story as well. It was a woman police officer that solved the crime. If folks aren't watching a video, that was in air quotes. She was kind of forced to refer to herself as a woman officer, Gladys, versus just being an officer. But yeah, in the real case, apparently it was a woman who kind of led to the breakthrough.
Of course, because she could see the nuance, whereas the, blockhead guys could only see the most obvious thing, which is, Rose is an angry lady, so she must be the one. And there was a scene at the very end where they find the culprit and they're actually comparing how Rose swears and the real letter writer swears. And it was such a funny scene
Oh
because
my gosh.
Rose's swearing was very modern and up to date, whereas the culprit's swearing was very archaic and used words that Rose even said, people don't use words like this. People don't swear like this. This has nothing to do with the way people actually talk. But you can see that this person who did it, which we will reveal shortly, had no clue about human sexuality or anything like that. So they're going to use these very archaic and kind of weird sounding curses because it's not rooted in her real life.
Yeah, just on that note, there's another. I mean, every scene with Olivia Colman in anything she does is amazing, but she's able to convey such subtlety in her expression. And kind of on that note of never having the opportunity to explore her sexuality, when the officers are interrogating her about what it has been like living next door to Rose, to Jessie Buckley's character, she goes through in her mind and she recalls a scene where she can hear Rose having sex with her partner, and she doesn't talk about that to the officer, but you can see through Olivia Colman's expression that it's not a disgust that she's recalling. It's like a longing that she hasn't ever had the opportunity to explore that and to experience that.
Yes, and one of the other things we discover is that she had a man in her life who she cared about and who wanted to be with her, and her father chased him away because he wanted her to stay at home and take care of him. And so his
Mhm.
selfishness, his brutishness deprived his daughter of having her own life and her own relationship and her own fulfillment as an adult woman. And she remained his little girl who, was basically his maid.
Yeah, I'm sure that you could spend quite some time going into a Freudian analysis there on that relationship. But while we've kind of skirted around it, it's, I think, fairly obvious at this point, but I think we can have the grand reveal. Yeah. So at about the midway point, we realize that it is, in fact, Edith Swan. It's Olivia Colman's character who has been writing these nasty letters to herself initially, and then also to the people in the town.
To incriminate
Yeah,
Rose.
to incriminate Rose,
Yeah.
which again is fascinating on so many levels as a real story, right? But also in this film. But the initial reveal of this is so interesting because she has been sent to her room to write Bible verses by her father, and she does that for a time, but then her hands start to ache. She just can't take this any longer, and then she dives into this vulgarity. What was your kind of reaction? I'm curious when
Okay.
this was first revealed.
Oh, this is kind of the epitome of something that I've been thinking about for many years as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, which is that when we repress and we shove this stuff down, whatever it is, our anger, our lust, our hurt, whatever, repression always leads to, seepage outward. We can't just shove it in. It has to leak out somewhere. And so it leaked out in these very, very nasty little letters. And so I think that she's so enraged at her father and so enraged at her mother for failing to protect her from her
Mm,
father, and so enraged at Rose for having the life that she can't have, and so
mm,
enraged at society and at the patriarchy and just like everything. And she longs for a sexual life, obviously. She longs to be a full woman and have a man like Rose does and to have sex and to be a normal woman. And so all that repression, because she's a good Christian spinster, it all comes out in this almost pornographic letters. And of course, she has to say that they're from Rose and sent to her, but also she wants her parents to read these letters. she's attacking her parents. She's forcing them to read this
Hmm.
smut that she has written. So it's like this passive aggressive behavior, right? She's subjecting them to this horrifying stuff. And doesn't her mother die of shock in reading one of
Literally,
them?
yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So she kills her mother
yeah.
and she scandalizes her father. So she's punishing her parents by repeatedly forcing them to read these letters. And she even reads them out loud and she takes this glee in doing so. So it's a way for her to punish them, to express her anger, but indirectly, which is what passive aggressive anger is, and to blame someone else. So the other person gets to take responsibility and she gets to keep assaulting her parents with words, or and once her mother's gone, just her father with words. And it's a way for her to indirectly express her, rage and her unfulfilled lust and just smack it in their face. That's how I saw
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I agree. I think it may have kind of changed over time for her character, and I suppose the real Edith as well, just in the sense that it starts off directed at herself, right? And then it kind of expands elsewhere. And as the film progresses, she continues to write these letters even when she knows that people are starting to suspect her. And in fact, again, this is kind of illustrated through the brilliance of Olivia Colman without saying a word, but there's a scene in which she knows that the police officer, Officer Gladys, in tandem with some other women in the town, are trying to catch her, sending a letter. And so she knows they're following her and she puts this letter into the post box. And you can see the glee, the excitement, right, that she's feeling, again, without saying a word, Olivia Colman. But what was your take from a psychological perspective about why she continued to do this, even knowing that the threat was imminent,
Yeah.
really?
So when we talk about compulsion, compulsive behavior, right? That comes from a very deep place inside ourselves, right? This powerful need to enact some kind of behavior because we think that there's a payoff, some kind of a payoff. And for her, it was catharsis, right? She got to like let out all this stuff. It was also punishing her parents. And then it was also strategic because when she was writing the letters around town, she was sending them to, the judge, the lawyers, like she was sending it to people who would be most offended and who would be more likely to be angry at Jessie Buckley's character and convict her and send her to jail. But I think she felt this overwhelming compulsion. She couldn't stop, even if she would have wanted to stop. She just had to because she had so much rage and so much hurt and so much lust. She just had to keep writing these letters because it was her only outlet. And I think with the glee, I think it's this kind of ambivalence because part of her was angry at those women because all those women were taking Rose's side, right? The police officer and the two older women in town, they were all trying to help Rose. And Rose was the outcast, the misfit, the bad girl. And she was the good Christian spinster. And why were they taking Rose's side and not hers, right? And so she was furious. And so she was more furious. So she had this glee because she was kind of like having this battle with them and she was going to win, right? But also, I think the ambivalence is she also wanted to get caught because it's just an untenable situation. She was
Mhm.
so miserable and so alienated from herself. And like with every compulsive behavior, it doesn't actually make you feel better. It doesn't bring you relief. So here she was just, had no power against this kind of like the 12 steps, I have no power over my addiction. Like she really had no
Mhm.
power over her addiction to write these letters, but she was desperate to also stop. And so she was putting herself in more and more high risk situations in the hopes of hitting rock bottom and finally being able to stop, which of course, eventually she did.
Mhm.
She had to. She got
Yeah.
caught. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that kind of leads us to what I found to be a very interesting, not just final act, but final kind of a couple scenes of this film, right? She is caught. She's going to go to prison. Rose is going to be free. She's going to be able to live her life. And a couple things happen at the end of the movie. First, we
Yes.
have this interaction between Edith and Rose in the hallway of the
Yes.
courts with an amazing just couple lines of dialogue that I think wrap up the film and the relationship between these women, and to your point, kind of the behavior that Edith was exhibiting. Jessie Buckley's character stops her and she says something like, "Can you tell me why now, Edith? Like, why did you do this?" And she says, "I don't think I can. I wish it wasn't you, but once I got started, I couldn't stop."
Right.
Yeah.
And really, if she had understood why, she wouldn't be doing it, because she would have understood that she was full of all these feelings and she needed to deal with them. And so it was truly an unconscious drive compelling her to start, and then she couldn't stop, like with a compulsion, until she put herself in the position where she had to stop. But yeah, I mean, she really did have that love-hate relationship with Rose, and under other circumstances, she would have been her friend. If her father and mother hadn't abandoned her in that way, and had been good parents, I'm sure they would have been the best of friends. And maybe Olivia Colman's character would have been a lot like Rose, and maybe would have helped Rose kind of find that middle ground. But she was so traumatized and she couldn't. So she liked her, but she hated her. And so Rose was the perfect foil. So she had to use her.
Well, yeah, and I mean, even in Rose's reply to this, she says something like, "And if I thought that if I could be more like you, I would be all right." And
Yeah.
that is such a powerful line in itself. We
Right.
have these two women who are kind of broken inside, who, to your point, have experienced trauma in their lives and have sought someone or something external to kind of save them in a sense. So we
Yeah.
learn that despite the seemingly different personalities and characteristics, these two women are so alike. And that scene was just a really, really strong scene for me.
And you said there was another scene as well at the end?
Yeah, so there was a subsequent scene after that that kind of ties up some other thematic links, I think, as well. I mean, to me at least, Edith's father can be taken literally as an abusive father. He certainly is, and that's true. But to me, he's kind of a symbol of these broader societal structures that
Yeah.
have been imposed on both Rose and
Yeah.
Edith, and he is being challenged for the first time, just as these structures are starting to be challenged,
Yeah.
not for the first time, but starting to be challenged more and more, and he doesn't know how to react. And as she enters this police vehicle, she just starts laughing and laughing and laughing. And I found that so interesting on the literal father daughter angle, but also how it kind of represents the inevitable or the beginning of these societal structures kind of crumbling. It was quite fascinating.
But even before she laughs, remember he says, "I'll get you off. You're a good girl. I'll
Hmm.
get you off." And she goes, "I'm not coming back.
No,
I'm not
no.
coming back." And then
Yeah.
she starts laughing,
Yeah.
and it's like
Exactly.
she's free of him.
Hmm.
So like she's had to create this crazy situation in order to
Hmm.
be free of her parents. She's had to kill her mother literally, and then go to jail to be
Yeah.
free of her father. And she would rather be in jail than live with her father.
That's
Imagine.
freedom.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
imagine how
Yeah.
bad it must be
Yeah.
living with this man, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, it was we were talking about how this film had kind of mixed reviews, and I was wondering, like,
Mhm.
what kind of things were people saying that was negative about, this film?
From everything that I've come across, it is not so much that there has been directly or explicitly negative commentary, but I think a lot of folks not getting it or
Right,
not really seeing the point or thinking that it is perhaps just redundant. And it's so fascinating, right, when we have this subversion on screen. We have these two women saying things that women don't say. We have a comedy led by women that is normally led by men. And while I don't want to be reductionist here, I think it's blatantly obvious that at least some of the reaction is kind of an uncertainty, not knowing how to kind of react to something that we don't normally see.
right. I think you're right. I think that it's a tremendously feminist film, and it's also like I said before, a film about, women's rage and lust and desire for power. And, and it's not a pretty film. It shows some ugliness in how the father abuses, and how the mother abandons, and how, Rose's character is kind of wild and out of control, how Edith's character is, repressed and then leaking this smut, so it's not a pretty film in that sense, but I think it's so incredibly astute. Whoever wrote it was like, I wish I could remember the writer's name, because they really have a tremendous. Sorry?
Yeah, it was Johnny Sweet
Johnny
who
Sweet.
who wrote. Yeah, I know. He's a British comedian, and then the director Thea Sherrick, I think, really brought everything together. She has come from a theater background and has so much experience directing actors that I think that really is what
Yeah.
brought everything together, in the sense that we're empathizing with all of these women,
Yes,
even Edith,
for
right? And I
sure.
think that certainly can come to the writing, but also Thea Sherrick's direction of these women kind of having the audience empathize without even realizing that we're doing
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
Yeah, the writing was so psychologically right on. And, when you talk about empathizing, that's such a great point, because, Edith is a victim. She's a victim of, her father's abuse and her mother's inability to protect her. And Rose is a victim. And the police officer, Gladys, the woman police officer, is a victim
Yeah.
of her system, because she's smarter than her boss and her colleague. And
Hmm.
they have all the advantages because of their gender. And of course, we're going to empathize with them, because it's like the odds are against them all to succeed, right? And nevertheless, Gladys, prevails, and, Rose gets off, and Olivia's character, Edith, at least she gets free. At least she gets
Hmm.
free, if nothing else. But
Hmm.
yeah, of course we empathize, because there's no real villain. The only villain in the story is the patriarchy, really,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
maybe that's why it wasn't as well liked. I was joking
Yeah.
with you before that we both loved Poor Things, and it was also
Hmm.
about, women's rage and women's power and women's sexuality. But, I said, there wasn't sufficient full frontal nudity, and,
Yeah.
and the sex act for people to love it as much as they loved Poor Things.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. That's a whole nother discussion.
For
Yeah.
sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really fun talking with you. Like, do you have
Mhm.
any like final words about this movie, so that, even though the listener knows the story, they
Mhm.
still would want to go and see it because it's such a fine film?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things to like about this, and it's one of those projects that is worth a rewatch as well when you have that additional context. I know, going back through the second time, particularly paying attention to Olivia Colman and her very minute facial expressions is so amazing. And I think that hopefully we can see these women as nuanced characters. We tend to paint with a very broad brush, but I think that the writing and direction here really, really showcase them.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a real pleasure to watch the film, and it was a real pleasure to talk with you about
Mhm.
it, Adam Manery. Thank you so much for coming on the Real Mental podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. While you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 140 episodes and counting? And if you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening!